Grumpy CEO's routine disrupted by cheerful new neighbor. He had no idea she'd change his life. Hello? Welcome. Leave a like, subscribe, activate notifications, and enjoy this story. Richard Cooper had everything: a towering office, millions in the bank, and a reputation for being untouchable. But inside, he was empty. The world outside his penthouse felt cold, distant, and meaningless. Each morning, the sun rose over the New York skyline, but Richard didn't care. He had lost the only person who made life worth living, and now all he had left was his relentless routine and the deafening silence of loneliness, until she appeared. The new neighbor wasn't supposed to mean anything. A cheerful woman with an infectious laugh, always humming a tune and waving hello. Richard found her presence irritating, a distraction from the controlled world he had built for himself. But something about her began to tug at the edges of his carefully guarded heart. Little by little, her joy seeped through the cracks of his solitude, forcing him to confront feelings he had buried long ago. And then, just as quickly as she entered his life, ERV. As their lives collided in ways Richard never saw coming, he was faced with a choice: cling to the safety of his isolation, or risk everything for a fleeting chance at something more. But time was running out, and neither of them had any idea just how much was truly at stake. The incessant patter of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard Cooper's penthouse apartment seemed to mock the silence within. It was another dreary day in New York City, the kind that blended seamlessly into the next, much like the CEO's life had for the past 2 years. Richard stood motionless, his steely gaze fixed on the grey cityscape beyond the glass. At 52, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair that spoke of wisdom beyond his years. Yet, the deep creases etched around his eyes and the perpetual downturn of his mouth hinted at a man carrying a burden far heavier than his tailored suit would suggest. 2 years, 730 days since he'd last heard Sarah's laugh, felt her warm embrace, or seen her smile light up a room. The hole her sudden death had left in his life was a void he'd desperately tried to fill with work, routine, and an almost obsessive need for control. As he turned away from the window, his eyes fell on the tastefully minimalist decor of his living room. Everything was in its place, sterile and perfect, just as he liked it, just as Sarah would have hated it. The thought sent a jolt of pain through his chest, which he quickly suppressed. Emotions were messy, unpredictable. He'd locked them away long ago, along with his heart. The sharp trill of his phone cut through the silence, jolting Richard back to the present. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening at the caller ID. Johnson Associates, the potential client he'd been courting for months. With a deep breath, he answered, his voice crisp and professional.
Cooper speaking.
The conversation was brief, each word from the other end of the line feeling like a dagger to his carefully constructed world. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cooper, but we've decided to go with another firm." Richard's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles turning white. "I see," he managed, his tone betraying nothing of the turmoil beneath. "Thank you for considering us." As the call ended, Richard fought the urge to hurl the phone across the room. Instead, he placed it gently on the coffee table, his movements deliberate and controlled. This loss, this failure, threatened to crack the veneer of his perfectly ordered life. With mechanical precision, he moved towards the door, ready to face another day at the office. As he reached for his coat, a flash of white caught his eye. Frowning, he bent down to retrieve a small envelope that had been slipped under his door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, looping and cheerful. It stood out starkly against the stark modernity of his apartment. Curiosity getting the better of him, Richard tore it open, only to feel his blood run cold as he read the contents. "Dear neighbor, I'm so sorry for your loss. I know words can't ease the pain, but please know that you're in my thoughts. If you ever need anything, even just a friendly ear, I'm right next door. Warmly, Claire." The note slipped from Richard's fingers, fluttering to the ground like a fallen leaf. How dare she? How dare this stranger, this intruder, presume to understand his pain? The raw emotion he'd kept at bay for so long threatened to overwhelm him. With trembling hands, he picked up the note, crumpling it in his fist before tossing it into the trash. He didn't need pity, especially not from some overly cheerful, nosy neighbor he'd never even met. As he stepped into the hallway, the faint sound of music and laughter drifted from the apartment next door. It grated on his nerves, a stark reminder of the joy he'd lost, of the life he no longer lived. The elevator ride down to the lobby was mercifully empty, allowing Richard to compose himself. By the time he stepped out onto the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan, his mask was firmly back in place, the stern, unapproachable CEO that his employees both feared and respected. But as he climbed into the back of his waiting town car, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself felt just a little less secure. The note, that simple act of kindness from a stranger, had found a crack in his armor. As the car merged into the morning traffic, Richard closed his eyes, trying to push away the memory of Sarah's smile, the echo of her laugh. But for the first time in 2 years, the memories refused to fade. They lingered, bittersweet and painful, a reminder of all he'd lost and all he'd locked away. Little did Richard know that the cheerful neighbor next door, the one whose laughter had irritated him so deeply, would be the key to unlocking his frozen heart. Claire, with her sunny disposition and hidden depths, was about to disrupt his carefully ordered world in ways he could never have imagined. As the rain continued to fall on the bustling city, fate had set in motion a series of events that would force Richard to confront his past, open his heart, and rediscover the joy of living. The journey ahead would be filled with laughter, tears, and unexpected twists. But for now, Richard Cooper remained oblivious, lost in his world of numbers, contracts, and carefully maintained emotional distance. The day stretched before him, promising more of the same: meetings, phone calls, and the relentless pursuit of success. But as his car turned onto Park Avenue, a tiny seed of change had been planted. Whether he liked it or not, Richard Cooper's life was about to be turned upside down by the force of nature that was his new neighbor, Claire. Richard's day at the office had been nothing short of disastrous. The loss of the Johnson Associates contract had sent ripples through the company, and he'd spent hours in damage control mode. By the time he dragged himself back to his apartment building, the sky had darkened to a moody indigo, mirroring his tumultuous state of mind. As the elevator doors slid open on his floor, a burst of laughter assaulted his ears. There, struggling with an armload of groceries, was a woman he assumed must be Claire, his new neighbor. She was shorter than he'd imagined, with wild curls barely contained in a messy bun and eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "Oh, hi there," she chirped, her voice warm and inviting. "You must be Mr. Cooper. I'm Claire. I just moved in next door." She awkwardly stuck out her hand, nearly dropping an apple in the process. Richard stared at her outstretched hand for a moment before giving it a curt shake. "Miss—" "Oh, just Claire is fine," she beamed, seemingly unfazed by his coldness. "I hope you got my note. I know it's not much, but I just wanted to—" "It was unnecessary," Richard cut her off, his voice clipped. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd refrain from slipping things under my door in the future." Claire's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, I'm sorry if I overstepped. I just thought—" "You thought wrong," Richard interrupted again, fishing for his keys. "Now, if you'll excuse me." He could feel her eyes on him as he unlocked his door, her sunny disposition an unwelcome intrusion on his carefully maintained gloom. Just as he was about to step inside, her voice stopped him. "Mr. Cooper." He turned, exasperation clear on his face. Claire's smile had softened, a touch of concern in her eyes. "I know it's not my place, but if you ever want to talk, or just have a cup of coffee, my door's always open." For a fleeting moment, Richard felt a crack in his armor, a tiny part of him yearning for the simple kindness she offered. But he quickly squashed it, nodding curtly before disappearing into his apartment. As days turned into weeks, Claire's persistent cheerfulness became an unexpected constant in Richard's life. Her music would drift through the walls, her laughter echoing in the hallway. She'd greet him every morning in the elevator with a bright, "Good morning, Mr. Cooper," despite his monosyllabic responses. One particularly gloomy Saturday, Richard found himself staring out his window, nursing a glass of scotch. The sound of Claire's music filtered through the walls, a peppy tune that grated on his nerves. He was about to bang on the wall when the music suddenly cut off, replaced by the murmur of a hushed phone conversation. Curiosity got the better of him, and he moved closer to the wall, straining to hear. Claire's voice, usually so bubbly, sounded strained. "No, I understand. Yes, I'll be there. Thank you, Doctor." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard found himself holding his breath, an inexplicable unease settling in his stomach. After a few moments, the music resumed, but it was different now. A melancholy piano piece that seemed to echo the sudden shift in mood. Richard stepped back from the wall, shaken by the unexpected glimpse behind Claire's cheerful facade. For the first time, he wondered if there was more to his neighbor than met the eye. The next morning, Richard found himself lingering in the lobby, unconsciously timing his departure with Claire's usual schedule. When she appeared, her smile seemed a little forced, dark circles barely concealed beneath her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Cooper," she said, her voice lacking its usual pep. Richard nodded, studying her face. "Ms. Claire," he corrected himself, surprising them both. "Are you all right?" Claire's eyes widened slightly, clearly caught off guard by his concern. "Oh, I'm fine," she said quickly, waving off his question. "Just didn't sleep well. Nothing a good cup of coffee won't fix." As they rode the elevator down in silence, Richard found himself stealing glances at her. There was something in the set of her shoulders, the tightness around her eyes, that spoke of a burden she was trying hard to hide. When they reached the ground floor, Claire turned to him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Have a great day, Mr. Cooper." As she walked away, Richard felt an unfamiliar urge to call her back, to offer, what? Comfort? Understanding? He shook his head, pushing the thought away. He had his own problems to deal with. Whatever was going on with Claire, it wasn't his concern. But as he climbed into his waiting car, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The wall he'd built around himself, so impenetrable for so long, had developed a tiny crack, and through that crack, a sliver of light was starting to shine, warm, inviting, and terrifyingly unfamiliar. Little did Richard know, this was just the beginning. The coming weeks would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, about life, and about the cheerful neighbor who was slowly but surely melting the ice around his heart. As his car pulled away from the curb, Richard caught a glimpse of Claire in his rearview mirror. She was standing on the sidewalk, her face turned up to the sky, eyes closed as if in prayer. The sight stirred something in him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. For the first time in 2 years, Richard Cooper found himself curious about someone else's story, and that curiosity would be the first step on a journey that would change his life forever. The New York summer was in full swing, the heat turning the city into a shimmering mirage of concrete and steel. For Richard Cooper, it was just another day in his air-conditioned office, poring over quarterly reports and acquisition proposals. But even as he immersed himself in work, Claire's note from weeks ago lingered in the back of his mind like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. As he rode the elevator up to his penthouse that evening, the familiar sound of Claire's laughter drifted down the hallway. Richard felt the usual twinge of irritation, but it was tinged with something else now, a curiosity he couldn't quite shake. Just as he was about to unlock his door, a loud crash came from Claire's apartment, followed by a muffled curse. Before he could stop himself, Richard found himself knocking on her door. "Claire, is everything all right?" The door swung open, revealing a flustered Claire, her hair wild, and a smear of what looked like paint across her cheek. "Mr. Cooper, I'm so sorry about the noise. I was trying to hang this painting and, well..." She gestured helplessly at the mess behind her. Richard's eyes swept over the chaos in her apartment, a stark contrast to his own meticulously ordered space. Colorful canvases leaned against walls, Books were stacked haphazardly on every surface, and a half-finished mural sprawled across one wall. "Do you need any help?" The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Claire's eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, I couldn't possibly ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering," Richard cut in, surprising himself with his insistence. A warm smile spread across Claire's face. "Well, in that case, I'd be grateful for the help, Mr. Cooper." As Richard stepped into the apartment, he felt as if he was crossing some invisible threshold. The air was thick with the scent of paint and something floral. Lavender, perhaps. It was chaotic, messy, and yet alive in a way his own space hadn't been in years. They worked in companionable silence for a while, Richard's precise movements a counterpoint to Claire's more haphazard approach. As he helped her hang the painting, a vibrant, abstract piece that hurt his eyes to look at directly, he noticed a thin, white scar on her wrist, partially hidden by her bracelet. "That's an interesting scar," he found himself saying, immediately regretting his lack of tact. Claire's hand flew to her wrist, her smile faltering for just a moment. "Oh, this old thing? It's nothing really, just a reminder of a different time in my life." The pain in her eyes was unmistakable, and for a moment, Richard saw a reflection of his own grief. He opened his mouth to inquire further, but Claire quickly changed the subject. "So, Mr. Cooper, what do you think of the painting? I know it's a bit loud." Richard studied the canvas, trying to find something diplomatic to say. "It's certainly unique." Claire laughed, the sound filling the room like sunshine. "That's a very polite way of saying it's awful. Don't worry, I painted it myself. I'm under no illusions about my artistic talents." For the first time in what felt like forever, Richard felt the corners of his mouth twitch upward. "Well, I wouldn't say awful. Perhaps enthusiastically colorful." Claire's laughter redoubled, and to his surprise, Richard found himself chuckling along with her. The sound of his own laughter felt foreign, almost painful, like a muscle long unused. As the laughter subsided, an awkward silence fell between them. Richard suddenly felt exposed, as if he'd revealed too much of himself in that moment of mirth. "I should go," he said abruptly, moving towards the door. "I have work to do." Claire's smile dimmed a little, but she nodded understandingly. "Of course. Thank you for your help, Mr. Cooper. It means a lot." As Richard retreated to the safety of his own apartment, he felt off balance, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. He'd laughed. Actually laughed. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Later that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Richard couldn't shake the image of Claire's scar or the pain he'd glimpsed in her eyes. It occurred to him that perhaps there was more to his cheerful neighbor than met the eye. Just as he was drifting off to sleep, a muffled sound caught his attention. It was coming from Claire's apartment, soft, choked sobs that spoke of a deep, private pain. Richard found himself standing by the wall, hand pressed against it, an inexplicable urge to comfort her rising in his chest. But he didn't move. He couldn't. The wall between them might as well have been a mile wide, built of his own fears and insecurities. As Claire's sobs faded into silence, Richard returned to his bed, more unsettled than ever. For the first time in 2 years, he felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought long dead, empathy. And with it came a terrifying realization. The walls he'd built to keep pain out were also keeping him trapped inside. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Richard's dreams were filled with vibrant colors, infectious laughter, and a pair of eyes that seemed to see right through him. The first crack had appeared in his carefully constructed facade, and though he didn't know it yet, it was only the beginning. The following weeks brought subtle but unmistakable changes to Richard Cooper's life. He found himself lingering in the lobby each morning, timing his departure to coincide with Claire's. Their elevator rides, once filled with awkward silence, now occasionally held snippets of conversation. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves skittered across the sidewalk outside their building, Richard surprised himself, and Claire, by holding the elevator door open for her. "Good morning, Mr. Cooper," Claire beamed, slightly out of breath from her rush. "Thank you for waiting." Richard nodded, his usual gruff demeanor softening almost imperceptibly. "Good morning, Claire." As the elevator descended, Richard couldn't help but notice the dark circles under Claire's eyes, poorly concealed by makeup. She seemed paler than usual, her typically boundless energy somewhat muted. "Are you feeling all right?" The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Claire's eyes widened in surprise, then quickly masked it with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, I'm fine. Just a bit under the weather. Nothing to worry about." Richard frowned, unconvinced. As the elevator doors opened to the lobby, he found himself saying, "Take care of yourself, Claire." The genuine concern in his voice seemed to catch them both off guard. Claire's smile softened, becoming more genuine. "I will. Thank you, Mr. Cooper." As Richard watched her walk away, a strange urge to do something, anything, to help her welled up inside him. It was an unfamiliar feeling, one he'd thought long buried with Sarah. That evening, as Richard returned home, he paused outside his door. Before he could second-guess himself, he bent down and placed a single sunflower, bright and cheerful just like Claire, on her welcome mat. The next morning, as he left for work, Richard noticed a small note taped to his door. In Claire's looping handwriting, it simply said, "Thank you. It made my day." For the first time in years, Richard felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with his morning coffee. Days passed, and Richard found himself paying more attention to the sounds from Claire's apartment. The music still played, but it seemed softer now, more melancholy. He caught glimpses of her in the hallway, always with a smile, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One Saturday afternoon, as Richard was returning from a rare outing to the local deli, he quite literally ran into Claire in the hallway. She stumbled, and he instinctively reached out to steady her. As his hand grasped her arm, he felt how thin she'd become, how fragile she seemed. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Cooper," Claire laughed, but it sounded forced. "I'm such a klutz today." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but his words died in his throat as he noticed a pill bottle that had fallen from Claire's purse. The label bore the unmistakable red warning of a serious medication. Claire followed his gaze and quickly snatched up the bottle, shoving it back into her purse. "It's nothing," she said hurriedly, her cheerful mask slipping for just a moment. "Just vitamins." Richard knew he should let it go, knew it wasn't his place to pry. But the concern that had been growing over the past weeks finally overrode his usual reticence. "Claire," he said softly, "what's going on?" For a moment, it looked like she might break down right there in the hallway. But then, with visible effort, she pulled herself together. "It's complicated, Mr. Cooper, but I promise, I'm handling it." Before he could press further, Claire retreated to her apartment, leaving Richard standing in the hallway, more worried than ever. That night, unable to sleep, Richard found himself drawn to his home office. On an impulse he couldn't quite explain, he opened his laptop and began researching. The name on Claire's pill bottle, the symptoms he'd observed, it all painted a picture that made his blood run cold. As the first rays of dawn crept through his window, Richard sat back in his chair, feeling as though the world had shifted on its axis. Claire, his vibrant, cheerful neighbor, was fighting for her life against a vicious disease. The realization hit him like a physical blow. For the first time in years, Richard felt the walls he'd built around his heart begin to crumble in earnest. The pain of potentially losing someone he cared about, and yes, he had to admit to himself that he did care about Claire, was acute and terrifying. But mixed with the fear was something else, a fierce determination. Richard Cooper, the man who had shut himself off from the world for so long, found himself wanting, needing to help. As he stood to make a pot of coffee, his eyes fell on a framed photo of Sarah, smiling and full of life. For the first time in 2 years, looking at her didn't bring just pain. It brought a bittersweet mix of memory and renewed purpose. "I think I understand now, Sarah," he whispered to the empty room. "I think I'm ready to start living again." Little did Richard know, His decision to open his heart again would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only his life, but Claire's as well. The journey ahead would be filled with laughter, tears, and revelations that would shake them both to their core. As the sun rose over New York City, casting long shadows across Richard's apartment, a new day dawned, not just for the city, but for the man who had been sleepwalking through life for far too long. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of the coming winter as Richard paced nervously outside Claire's apartment. His hand hovered over the door, poised to knock, but hesitation held him back. How could he broach the subject of what he'd discovered? Would she see it as an invasion of privacy? Before he could decide, the door swung open, revealing a startled Claire. "Mr. Cooper, I was just heading out to—" She stopped short, noticing his troubled expression. "Is everything okay?" Richard took a deep breath. "Claire, I think we need to talk. May I come in?" Confusion flickered across her face, but she nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. The apartment was dimmer than usual, the usual riot of colors muted in the soft lamplight. Claire gestured for him to sit on the couch, perching herself on the edge of an armchair. "What's this about, Mr. Cooper?" she asked, her voice tinged with wariness. Richard clasped his hands together, steeling himself. "Claire, I know about your condition. I saw the medication you dropped, and I did some research." The color drained from Claire's face. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, but then her shoulders slumped in defeat. "How much do you know?" "Enough to understand that you're fighting a battle far tougher than anyone should face alone," Richard said softly. Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, and for the first time since he'd known her, her sunny facade cracked completely. "I didn't want anyone to know," she whispered. "I didn't want pity. I just wanted to live whatever time I have left bringing joy to others." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "Claire, No, please," she interrupted, wiping her eyes. "Let me explain. When I was diagnosed, I made a choice. I could spend my remaining time being bitter and angry, or I could try to make a difference, however small, in the lives of those around me." She gave a watery chuckle. "Even grumpy CEOs who seem like they could use a friend." The weight of her words hit Richard like a physical blow. All this time, while he'd been wallowing in his own grief, Claire had been facing her own mortality with grace and kindness. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why suffer alone?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Claire's smile was sad, but determined. "Because this isn't just my story, Mr. Cooper. It's also about my sister, Lily." As Claire spoke, Richard listened with growing amazement and heartache. She told him about Lily, her younger sister, who had cut ties with the family years ago after a bitter argument. Claire's diagnosis had given her a new purpose, to reconnect with Lily before it was too late. "I've been trying to track her down," Claire explained. "That's why I moved here. My last lead suggested she might be in New York, but so far I've hit nothing but dead ends." Richard felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in years, a desire to help, to make a difference. "Claire, I have resources, connections. Let me help you find her." Claire's eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Cooper, I couldn't possibly ask you to—" "You're not asking," he interrupted, echoing his words from weeks ago. "I'm offering." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of everything that had been revealed hanging between them. Then, to Richard's surprise, Claire began to laugh, a genuine, heartfelt sound that seemed to brighten the room. "What's so funny?" he asked, bewildered. Claire shook her head, still chuckling. "It's just, of all the people I've met since my diagnosis, I never expected the one to break through my everything's fine act would be my grumpy CEO neighbor." Richard felt the corners of his mouth twitch upward. "Well, I never expected my annoyingly cheerful neighbor to be the one to make me feel alive again." The admission hung in the air, startling them both with its honesty. Claire reached out, placing her hand over Richard's. "Thank you," she said softly, "for caring, for offering to help. It means more than you know." As Richard looked into Claire's eyes, He saw not just the pain and fear she'd been hiding, but also a strength and resilience that took his breath away. In that moment, he made a silent vow to help Claire find her sister. Yes, but also to be there for her, to ensure that whatever time she had left would be filled with more than just doctor's appointments and worry. As he left Claire's apartment that night, Richard felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Sadness, certainly, at the unfairness of Claire's situation, but also a sense of purpose, of connection, that he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. Back in his own apartment, Richard's eyes fell on the photo of Sarah. "I think you'd like her," he said softly to the smiling face in the frame. "She reminds me a bit of you, always thinking of others, even when facing the unthinkable." As he prepared for bed, Richard's mind was already whirring with plans. He'd use every resource at his disposal to help Claire find her sister, and in doing so, he realized he might just find a piece of himself that he'd thought was lost forever. Little did Richard know, the journey ahead would test them both in ways they couldn't imagine. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, not alone, but with Claire by his side. The weeks following Richard's discovery of Claire's condition flew by in a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Richard had mobilized every resource at his disposal to help find Claire's sister, Lily. Private investigators were hired, databases scoured, and old contacts reached out to. Claire's hope grew with each passing day, her smile a little brighter despite the toll her treatments were taking. It was a crisp Saturday morning when everything changed. Richard was in his home office, poring over the latest report from the investigator, when a loud thud from next door made him jump. He rushed to Claire's apartment, his heart pounding. "Claire?" he called, knocking urgently. When there was no response, he used the spare key she'd given him and burst inside. The sight that greeted him would be forever seared into his memory. Claire lay crumpled on the floor, her face ashen, a broken mug of tea spilled beside her. For a terrifying moment, Richard thought he was too late. "Claire!" he cried, dropping to his knees beside her. To his immense relief, she stirred weakly at his touch. Richard," she mumbled, her eyes unfocused. I don't feel so good." The next few hours passed in a blur of sirens, sterile hospital corridors, and terse conversations with doctors. Richard paced the waiting room, his mind a chaotic swirl of fear and regret. Why hadn't he insisted she move in with him, where he could keep a closer eye on her? Why hadn't he pushed her to be more aggressive with her treatments? "Mr. Cooper?" A tired-looking doctor approached him. "Ms. Summers is stable, but I'm afraid her condition has deteriorated significantly. We're moving her to the ICU." Richard felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. "Can I see her?" The doctor nodded, leading him through the maze-like corridors to Claire's room. Richard steeled himself before entering, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of Claire, vibrant, cheerful Claire, looking so small and fragile in the hospital bed. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached. "Richard," she whispered, a ghost of her usual smile on her lips. "I'm sorry for scaring you." Richard shook his head, taking her hand gently. "Don't apologize, I'm just glad you're okay." The lie felt bitter on his tongue. She wasn't okay, and they both knew it. "Did we find her?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible. "Lily?" Richard's heart clenched. Despite their best efforts, Lily remained elusive. "Not yet," he said softly. "But we will. I promise." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I don't think I have much time left, Richard. I'm scared." The admission, so at odds with the brave face she'd worn for months, broke something in Richard. He felt tears of his own threatening to fall. "I'm right here, Claire. You're not alone." As Claire drifted off to sleep, exhausted by their brief conversation, Richard found himself overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotion. The prospect of losing Claire, bright, compassionate Claire who had brought light back into his life, was almost more than he could bear. For the first time since Sarah's death, Richard allowed himself to truly feel the depth of his grief and fear. He wept silently, clutching Claire's hand, mourning not just for her, but for all the time he'd wasted pushing people away. Hours passed, with Richard refusing to leave Claire's side. As dawn broke, painting the sterile room in soft hues of pink and gold, Claire stirred again. "Richard," she murmured, her voice stronger than before. "I'm here," he replied, squeezing her hand gently. Claire's eyes, though clouded with pain, held a fierce determination. "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Richard said without hesitation. "Promise me you won't go back to the way you were before. Promise me you'll live, really live, even when I'm gone." The request hit Richard like a physical blow. "Claire, don't talk like that. You're going to be fine. We'll find Lily and—" "Richard," Claire interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "We both know that's not true. Please, I need to know that some good will come from this, that you'll open your heart again, that you'll let people in." Richard felt tears streaming down his face, unchecked. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice breaking. Claire squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "You can. You already have. Promise me, Richard. Please." Looking into Claire's eyes, seeing the mixture of fear and hope there, Richard found he couldn't refuse. "I promise," he whispered. A smile, bright as the rising sun, spread across Claire's face. "Thank you," she breathed, relaxing back into her pillows. As Claire drifted off to sleep once more, Richard sat by her side, his mind reeling. He realized with startling clarity that in trying to protect himself from pain, he'd also shut out all the beauty and joy life had to offer. Claire, in her brief time in his life, had shown him what it meant to truly live, to face adversity with grace and kindness. In that moment, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the hospital window, Richard made a silent vow. He would keep his promise to Claire, no matter how difficult it might be. He would find Lily. He would open his heart to the world again, and he would live every day with the same courage and compassion Claire had shown him. As he watched Claire sleep, peaceful despite the machines surrounding her, Richard felt a bittersweet mix of grief and gratitude. He didn't know what the coming days would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same again. The days that followed Claire's hospitalization were a blur of beeping machines, hushed conversations with doctors, and countless cups of lukewarm hospital coffee. Richard barely left her side, working remotely from a small table in the corner of her room, his laptop a constant companion. It was on a particularly gloomy Tuesday afternoon when Claire's condition took a turn for the worse. Richard was jolted from a fitful nap in the uncomfortable hospital chair by the sound of alarms blaring. Doctors and nurses rushed in, their voices urgent but controlled. "She's coding! Start chest compressions!" Richard watched in horror as the medical team worked frantically to stabilize Claire. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, mercifully, the alarms quieted and Claire's heartbeat stabilized. As the team filed out, the lead doctor pulled Richard aside. "Mr. Cooper, I'm afraid Claire's condition is deteriorating rapidly. It might be time to prepare yourself." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He nodded numbly, unable to form a response. As he returned to Claire's bedside, he found her awake, her eyes clearer than they had been in days. "Richard," she whispered, her voice weak but determined, "I need to talk to you." He leaned in close, taking her hand in his. "I'm here, Claire. What is it?" Claire's eyes locked onto his, filled with a mixture of sadness and fierce resolve. "I know I don't have much time left," she began, holding up a hand to stop Richard's protest. "No, please, let me finish. I need you to promise me something." Richard nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "Promise me you'll live, Richard. Really live. Not just exist, like you were doing when we met. I need to know that some good will come from all of this." Tears welled up in Richard's eyes. "Claire, No excuses," she interrupted, a ghost of her old smile playing on her lips. "Promise me you'll open your heart again, that you'll let people in, that you'll find joy in the little things, like I tried to show you." Richard felt a sob building in his chest. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice breaking. Claire squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "You can. You're stronger than you think, Richard. I've seen it. Promise me." Looking into Claire's eyes, seeing the mixture of pain and hope there, Richard found he couldn't refuse. "I promise," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. A beautiful smile spread across Claire's face, reminiscent of the sunny neighbor who had first greeted him in the hallway all those months ago. "Thank you," she breathed. As if the promise had lifted a weight from her shoulders, Claire seemed to relax. Her next words came out softer, more wistful. I wish I could have found Lily, to tell her I forgive her, that I love her." Richard's heart clenched. Despite their best efforts, Lily remained elusive. But in that moment, an idea struck him. "Claire," he said urgently, "what if you could still tell her?" Claire looked at him, confusion evident in her eyes. "Write her a letter," Richard explained, his words tumbling out rapidly. "Tell her everything you want to say. I promise you I will not rest until I find her and deliver it personally." Tears welled up in Claire's eyes, but this time they were accompanied by a smile. "You do that for me." "Of course," Richard said without hesitation. "It's the least I can do after everything you've done for me." With Richard's help, Claire penned a heartfelt letter to her sister. As she wrote, pouring out years of unspoken feelings and regrets, Richard saw a peace settle over her that had been absent since her hospitalization. When she finished, Claire handed the sealed envelope to Richard. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Richard took the letter, tucking it safely into his jacket pocket. "No, Claire, thank you. You've taught me more about living in these few months than I learned in years." They sat in companionable silence as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the hospital window. Claire's breathing grew more labored, but her hand remained firmly clasped in Richard's. "Richard," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Yes, Claire. Will you tell me about Sarah? About your life before? I'd like to hear it." And so, as the night deepened, Richard opened up. He told Claire about Sarah, about their love story, about the pain of losing her. He shared memories he'd locked away for years, laughing and crying, as he recounted both joyful and painful moments. As dawn broke, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds, Claire's grip on Richard's hand loosened. With her last breath, she whispered, "Thank you for letting me in, Richard. Now go live." The steady beep of the heart monitor flattened into a continuous tone. Claire was gone. Richard sat there, tears streaming down his face, feeling a complex mix of grief and gratitude. Claire had come into his life like a whirlwind, breaking down his carefully constructed walls and teaching him to live again. And now, even in death, she had given him a purpose: to find Lily, to deliver her final words, and to honor his promise to truly live. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, Richard stood, Claire's letter safely tucked against his heart. He had a promise to keep, a life to live, and a legacy of joy and kindness to honor. The journey ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, Richard Cooper felt ready to face it head-on. Claire's final gift to him had been the courage to open his heart again, and he was determined not to waste it. The autumn leaves crunched under Richard's feet as he made his way through the quiet cemetery. It had been 6 months since Claire's passing, and the world seemed different now, softer around the edges, more vibrant in color. He carried a bouquet of sunflowers, Claire's favorite, their bright petals a stark contrast to the somber surroundings. As he approached Claire's grave, Richard noticed he wasn't alone. A young woman stood there, her back to him, her shoulders shaking slightly. He slowed his pace, not wanting to intrude, when suddenly the woman turned. Their eyes met, and Richard felt his breath catch in his throat. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same warm brown eyes, the same curve of the jaw. This had to be Lily. "Are you Richard?" the woman asked hesitantly. Richard nodded, unable to find his voice for a moment. "Yes, I am, and you must be Lily." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "I got your messages. I'm so sorry I didn't come sooner. I didn't know how sick she was." Richard stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Claire understood. "She never stopped loving you, Lily." Reaching into his coat pocket, Richard pulled out the worn envelope containing Claire's final letter. "She wrote this for you. I promised her I'd deliver it personally." With trembling hands, Lily took the letter. As she read, tears flowed freely down her cheeks. Richard stood silently, giving her the space to process her sister's final words. When Lily finally looked up, her eyes were red, but filled with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. "Thank you for being there for her when I couldn't be. Claire wrote about how much you meant to her in her final days." Richard felt his own eyes misting over. "She changed my life, Lily. I was a different man before I met your sister, cold, closed off. She taught me how to live again." They stood in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own memories of Claire. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Lily turned to Richard. Would you tell me about her last days? About the Claire you knew?" Richard nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'd be honored. There's a little cafe just down the street. Why don't we go there and I'll tell you everything?" As they walked out of the cemetery together, Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had fulfilled his promise to Claire. He had found Lily and delivered her message. But more than that, he realized he was living up to his promise to truly live. Over steaming cups of coffee, Richard shared stories of Claire with Lily, her infectious laughter, her determination to spread joy even in the face of her illness, the way she had brought light into his dark world. Lily, in turn, shared childhood memories, filling in the gaps of Claire's life that Richard had never known. As the evening wore on, Richard found himself laughing and crying in equal measure. He was connecting with another person, opening his heart in a way he hadn't done since Sarah's death. It felt both terrifying and exhilarating. When they finally parted ways, exchanging numbers with promises to keep in touch, Richard walked back to his apartment with a lightness in his step he hadn't felt in years. The city around him seemed alive with possibility. Back in his living room, Richard's eyes fell on the photo of Sarah. For the first time in a long time, looking at her smiling face didn't bring just pain. It brought a bittersweet mix of love, gratitude, and hope for the future. "I think you'd be proud of me, Sarah," he said softly. "I'm learning to live again, to love again." As he prepared for bed that night, Richard thought about the journey he'd been on since Claire entered his life. From a closed-off, bitter man to someone who was learning to embrace life again. It was a transformation he never could have imagined. The next morning, as he stepped out of his apartment building, Richard paused to appreciate the crisp autumn air, the way the sunlight glinted off the buildings around him. He thought of Claire, of her infectious joy, and her final wish for him. With a smile, Richard set off down the busy New York street. He had a life to live, connections to nurture, and a promise to keep. And for the first time in years, he was excited about what the future might hold. As he walked, Richard made a silent vow to honor Claire's memory by living each day to its fullest, by opening his heart to new experiences and new people. He knew there would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and pain. But he also knew that he was stronger now, more resilient. Claire had given him the greatest gift of all, the courage to live again, and Richard was determined not to waste it.
Thank you very much for listening to this story. Comment below what you thought of the ending and from which city you're listening to us. If you enjoyed the story and want to hear more, click on the next story that's appearing on your screen now. Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a huge community that shares inspiring stories together. See you soon.